You won't believe how these 11 trust fund babies lost it all. From their extravagant spending to the tragic downfall, these stories tell us how poor money management can lead to disaster. Number 11. Harry and Molly Doty. Inheritance unknown. Back in the 19th century, there was a man named Calvin B. Doty. He was a legend in his time. Calvin Doty was a big deal in the iron business. He ran the Jefferson Iron Works at the lower end of town, and that's how he made his whole family super wealthy. Their house on South 3rd Street was a grand palace surrounded by huge gardens. People knew him far and wide for his incredible fortune. But here is where the story takes a sad turn. His kids, Harry and Molly, inherited good money, and they totally messed it up. We don't know exactly how much they got, but we know it was a lot, and they had no idea how to hold on to their fortune. So the siblings squandered it. Life was a party for them, but soon things started to look bad. The money disappeared into thin air. I guess that's what happens when you keep spending it. And you're probably thinking, what happened to Harry and Molly after that? Well, this story ended in tragedy. Harry was eventually sent to an asylum for the insane, and as for Molly, she spent her last days in an old people's home. Harry and Molly's riches to rags story ended with both all alone. But they're not the only ones who couldn't handle the wealth they inherited. Coming up next is the story of a trust fund baby who went off track even though she had a plan. Number 10. Allison Sintons, $66,000. Allison Sintons was a 22-year-old post-grad living with her parents. One day, her parents revealed that her grandfather had given her a share of his money. She was in complete shock, as she had never expected something like this. Her grandfather had left her 66 grand. It was like a dream come true for Allison. But before she could go on a splurging spree, her father gave her practical advice. He suggested putting the fund into a high-interest CD. That's a type of savings account with an agreed time when you don't make a withdrawal that earns a lot of money from interest. He thought that this would one day help Allison secure her own home. Now, that sounds like a brilliant move, right? But despite the fantastic financial plan her father shared with her, she seemed unimpressed. Allison thought of spending it on stuff she could get instantly instead of waiting for years. Owning a home was something far, far in the future, and she figured she had enough time to save up all the cash and buy her own property. After all, what's the use of having so much wealth if you can't enjoy it? But as a compromise, she did agree to some of her father's plans. In the end, he kinda won, and she actually had placed 61 grand into the CD. After that, Allison was happy to spend the rest of the $5,000. Unfortunately, it wasn't as much money as she thought. The $5,000 vanished in just 1 month. You probably already guessed that things were out of hand. She developed spending habits that she couldn't resist anymore. So Allison tapped into her savings to buy a few more things, like expensive clothes. Then she withdrew a bit more, and a little more again. Every time, she would have paid a penalty to the bank for withdrawing her savings before the agreed time had passed. In just 2 years, the whole inheritance was down to just a few $100s. In the end, she didn't have anywhere near enough to buy that house like her dad had hoped. Allison really blew it. Just like her, the next person on our list also wasted an amazing opportunity with bad decisions. Number 9. Ewan McAndrew, 128 grand. Ewan McAndrew was living an ordinary life, but one day things took a turn for him. He received a $128,000 inheritance after his grandfather passed away. He never knew that he would inherit such a hefty sum, so it seemed like a golden ticket. But he had no idea that it was a dark twist of fate. Ewan was young and he wanted to have some fun. He'd never learned to handle that much cash, so he didn't waste a single moment. Ewan blew all of it on flashy cars, fancy clothes, and drugs. Unfortunately, his newfound drug habit drained his bank account faster than he could imagine. With nothing left in his account, he was desperate to make ends meet. On top of that, he was suffering from withdrawal symptoms from the drugs. Ewan did not have many options, so he took a risky path. He resorted to selling cocaine to make some quick cash. But even that money disappeared in the blink of an eye. And then the worst happened. He got caught and was handed a 10-month jail sentence. He somehow had to find the money to pay for a lawyer and restitution. All these legal formalities were costly and started to drain what was left of Ewan's cash. In the end, all the funds he once had were wiped out. And we can't help but think his life would have looked much brighter if he'd never been given that money. The next story is about a person who inherited almost 7 times as much money as Ewan. But what did he do with it? Let's find out. Number 8. Graham Roos, $750,000. Graham Roos got a big surprise not long after his 26th birthday. His great aunt passed away, and he got a whopping $750,000 as an inheritance. He knew from the start that he would get some money, but this amount was way more than he had expected. Once that cash hit the bank, he thought he was set for life. The first thing he did was to say goodbye to his job and start living it up. He spent it like there was no tomorrow. Vacations, expensive art, you name it. But despite these purchases, there was a bigger problem in the picture. It was his excessive partying and drug addiction. But Graham didn't really care about his finances, at least not at that moment. He didn't even bother paying attention to his shrinking bank account. He just kept living the high life. And that's when things took a nosedive. His cash was gone before he knew it. And that was not all. After blowing all of his windfall, he also collected a huge amount of debt. At that point, he wasn't really left with many options. So, with a heavy heart, he decided to return to work. This was the only way to keep a roof over his head. Otherwise, he would have ended up on the street. But he only had himself to blame. If he just managed his money correctly, he might not have needed to go back. Graham Roos's reckless spending left him in a tricky spot. Like Graham, our next story is of a celebrity whose lavish lifestyle had a significant impact on her inheritance, but even that could not stop her. Number 7. Tori Spelling, $800,000. The Beverly Hills 90210 star Tori Spelling was also set to inherit a considerable amount of wealth from her father, Aaron Spelling. He was a television and film producer, and he was filthy rich. At the time of his death, he had a net worth of almost $600 million. But Tori had a bit of a spending problem. Her father knew all about that, and he was worried that if he gave her all that money, she would blow it in no time. So to save her from going down that hole, he only left her $800,000. This may seem like a lot to us regular people, but for someone used to the finer things in life, it wasn't that much. Despite a smaller share and a warning from her dad, Tori just couldn't stop herself from spending like there was no tomorrow. She had a serious love for clothes and sparkly jewelry. There were days when she would drop a massive $60,000 on spending sprees. To make matters worse, her shopping addiction resulted in severe financial troubles. She was ignoring her bills so she'd have more spending money. That meant she'd ended up owing more than $1 million in taxes. And one day, the officials came knocking, demanding that she repay her debts. This wasn't even the only time in Tori's life that she'd faced financial problems. For example, after her split from her husband, Dean McDermott, she was having a hard time leaving her money in the bank. What's more, her California home had this awful mold problem, so she, along with her 5 children, ended up staying in a cheap motel. And recently, Tori and her kids were spotted in an RV. Even though Tori is trying really hard to take care of her kids, it's not easy. People who know about these things say she's having a tough time finding a new place to live. All of this comes down to the fact that she had never been financially responsible. She should have listened to her father's advice. $1 million seems like a lot, right? But like Tori Spelling, the next person on the list went through a downward spiral. Number 6. Clarissa Dixon Wright, $3.4 million. Let's talk about Clarissa Dixon Wright, the famous lady from the British TV cooking show Two Fat Ladies. She had an amazing life in terms of money. Her father was a surgeon for the royal family, and her mother was from a well-known Singapore family. But in the late 70s, something happened in her life that changed everything. Her mother passed away, and she left her a big inheritance of around $3.4 million. At the same time, she had an excellent job as a lawyer in London, so she was making some really good cash there too. Sometimes, life has a strange way of handing us a fortune, and soon after her mother's death, Clarissa's problems started. She may have received enough money to last her lifetime, but the one thing it couldn't fix was the emptiness in her heart. She was really close to her mother, and not having her around hit her hard. While Clarissa was still trying to cope with her mother's death, her father passed away too. She loved her dad just as much as her mom, and losing both of them so close together left her feeling very alone. These painful realities of life led her into depression. Instead of seeking professional help, Clarissa took things into her own hands and started drinking. The more she drank, the worse things got, and that only made her drink even more. But it wasn't only her drinking habit that ate up her fortune. She wasted her cash on extravagances as well. Clarissa would party, gamble, and even go on jets, boats, and stay in posh hotels. Her wild living meant she could never be a lawyer again. And in 1982, she was penniless and ultimately ended up on the street. Clarissa was using money to try to fix her emotional pain, but the next trust fund baby on her list lost her fortune in a very different way. Number 5. Paris Hilton. $5.6 million. Paris Hilton turned being an heiress into a career as a celebrity. But it was all thanks to the famous Hilton hotel family. Her grandfather, Baron Hilton, started the Hilton hotel chain. But when Baron Hilton passed away in 2019, most of his money did not go to Paris or the family. Instead, he left a staggering 97% of his fortune to charity. And this left Paris with an inheritance of about $5.6 million. That sounds like a lot, but it wasn't close to as much as she was expecting to get. Why did he cut her out? Well, it seems like Baron Hilton was not too thrilled about the way Paris was living her life in the spotlight. She had her fair share of scandals like leaked sex tapes, reality shows, and DUIs. Baron Hilton was worried that all these antics were damaging the family name. So he decided to make a big statement by leaving the majority of his wealth to the charitable foundation linked to their hotel business. It was his way of saying that he would instead help others rather than fund a scandalous celeb lifestyle. Paris Hilton, despite her family's inheritance issues, always aimed to stand on her own 2 feet. She wanted to be self-sufficient from a young age. She didn't want to rely on her family for anything. And guess what? She achieved it. Paris made it big on her own. She raked in tons of money from her merchandise deals and even had a TV show with her husband, Carter Room. Her life has been quite the roller coaster, and she amassed a jaw-dropping fortune along the way. But if we talk about her lifestyle, it's far from ordinary. Paris did not hold back. She's known for her extravagant jet-setting adventures, wild partying, and some not-so-great behavior that has had everyone talking. She was not one to keep things low-key, that's for sure. With loads of cash on her hands, she did not shy away from overspending. One of her wildest purchases includes a mansion she built for her dogs right next to hers, and it cost her more than $300 grand. But it's not all lavish spending. Paris has had some run-ins with the law, especially when it came to spending on drugs. Over the years, she's had many warnings and trials because of her addiction habits, and every time it cost her money. While she didn't end up completely broke thanks to her ventures, she sure had her fair share of ups and downs. You can bet the money she inherited is pretty much gone by now. Unlike Paris, the next trust fund baby could not sustain his lifestyle and faced a tragic end. Number 4. John Harvey, $6 million. Coming up next is John Harvey, the 7th Marquess of Bristol, who was born into a wealthy English family. In the late 70s, when he turned 21, he was given $6 million as his birthday gift. Today, that would be nearly $65 million. But John did not just sit around and enjoy his riches. Nope, He was a smart guy. He didn't waste any time and put his riches to work in things like buying land, getting into the oil industry, and trying out different business ideas. And surprisingly, he made even more money doing that. A smart move, right? So it's safe to say that John Harvey was not just a rich kid, he was a rich kid who knew how to make his empire grow. However, things soon started to take a turn. Even though John Harvey was good at making money, he was even better at spending it. He went all out on things like yachts and cool sports cars. He also had some pricey friends around him. And soon he also got caught up in a bad habit: drugs. In just 10 years, he burned through more than $9 million on cocaine and heroin. I think we can all agree that's a colossal waste of money. Plus, the drugs got him into trouble with the law, too. Eventually, he was kicked out of the country. By the early 90s, he'd hit rock bottom. He was broke and sick because of his addiction. He wouldn't have to live life like that for long. Sadly, he passed away because his organs were damaged from his drug use. He was smart enough to achieve anything with his family's money, but he squandered his fortune and his life. And he's not the only one. The next person on our list inherited 8 times more than John, but went down a similar path. Number 3. Barbara Hutton, $50 million. Barbara Hutton became popular due to the television film Poor Little Rich Girl. On her 21st birthday, she received an incredible $50 million. That's a ton of cash, but we haven't even mentioned that this happened back in the 1930s. If we think about it in today's money, that's over 900 mil. But she hadn't received all that money as a celebration for turning 21. Instead, something tragic had happened. Her mother had sadly taken her own life. That is how Barbara got her hands on that fortune. Despite growing up rich, Barbara Hutton ended up feeling really unsure of herself when she became an adult. You see, her father was not around much, and her mother had suffered from depression her whole life. The only thing that made Barbara really happy was shopping, especially when it came to buying stuff for her loved ones. She gave them things like jewelry, stylish clothes, and even art that once belonged to Marie Antoinette. But that wasn't Barbara's only hobby. She was also married 7 times and had lots of flings. All of this made her riches disappear little by little. When she passed away in 1979 at 66 years old, she didn't have much left. Similar to Barbara's situation, the next person on the list wasted a big cash stash. Number 2. Huntington Hartford II, $90 million. Huntington Hartford II grew up rich, and he was used to a life where servants did everything for him. His father left him $90 million when he was just 11. All this money came from the family business called A&P. They had a nationwide network of grocery stores. After inheriting so much, Huntington wanted to experiment. So once he was old enough, he invested in Bahamian real estate. And he even used the money to work on something he was passionate about: a modeling agency. But Huntington was not an experienced businessman or an investor, and he did not have luck with any of these ventures. Even though he was trying his best, he lost over $30 million. His money troubles did not stop with bad investments. Huntington went through 4 expensive divorces, and each one was more expensive than the last. By 1992, he was broke and had to declare bankruptcy, trading his mansion for a shabby rental spot in Brooklyn. Think that's bad? The last trust fund baby on our list inherited a fortune twice that size and still lost it all. Number 1. Clint Murchison Jr., $200 million. In the late 1960s, Clint Murchison Jr. inherited a big pile of money from his father's oil business. He got a share of $200 mil. Clint loved expensive stuff, so this money was a dream come true. Unlike his father, who knew how to make money grow, Clint simply spent it on his dreams. He used millions to start the Dallas Cowboys in 1960 and tried his luck in other businesses too, like restaurants, oil, houses, and even a radio station. Unfortunately, most of these things did not work out, especially when the oil and housing markets were going down in the 1980s. Ultimately, things did not go as he had planned, and Clint had way too much debt to handle. At the age of 85, he had to give up and he filed for bankruptcy, saying that he could not pay his bills anymore. Then, 2 years later, he passed away, having sold everything he owned to try and fix his money problems. Having wealth is not enough to guarantee financial security if one starts being irresponsible. But the stories of financial mishaps do not end here. Watch our next video, Dumbest Ways Rock Stars Went Completely Broke, to see how rock stars lost their massive fortunes.